the Liberals, the Blue Team, their leader, Peter Dutton, has just promised that if they return to power in the next election, which will possibly be this year, 2025, they have committed to build 7 nuclear power plants around the country. My understanding is those power plants will be on the site of coal-fired power stations, many of them that are actually sunsetting or reaching the end of their life. Now, what has made me suspicious about this proposal is the timing, because the thing with a two-party system is they present the idea of being in opposition to each other, but they're not really. In order to harvest energy or interest for their policies and what they want to talk about, they have to always engage in an eternal culture war. Now, energy shouldn't be part of a culture war. It should be a rational discussion. But because nuclear is such a polarizing topic and its advocates are so passionate about it and its detractors are so passionate about it, it creates a lot of noise, a lot of interest, and it becomes something to talk about leading up to the election. But the thing is, in a two-party system, it's really the illusion of opposing each other, because they're pretty much aligned on all the things that matter to them, whether they're on the blue team or the red team. Oh, before I talk about the blue team and the red team, anybody viewing this from the US, this would be a bit confusing, because the blue team in Australia, the Liberal Party, well, liberalism, that word liberal in the US is associated with like progressive beliefs and policies, and blue is also the colour of the Democratic Party in the US. But because this is Australia and we're in the Southern Hemisphere, everything is flipped on its head, so it's reversed. So the blue team, which is part of our two-party system, the Liberal Party in Australia, they're actually traditionally seen as the conservative wing, some would say even reactionary wing, of Australian politics, whereas the red team, we associate red with the Republican Party in the US, but the red team in Australia, the Australian Labor Party, they're presented in the media, and indeed they present themselves as this, as the Progressive Party, the kinder, gentler party, not like the stuck in their ways Conservative Party, which is a blue team. So anyway, I'm splitting hairs. I'm simply drawing attention to the narrative, but if you've been on this earth long enough and followed politics and the news for long enough, you will see that very little changes, and that the two parties in a Western democracy, while they seem to be opposed to each other, they are actually united on the things that matter to them, which is increasing government spending, making government bigger, increasing bureaucracy, voting to increase their salaries, their remuneration each year as sitting members of Parliament, and centralising as much as they can. Nuclear power is an ideal technology or approach for a party that wants to centralise everything, because it requires massive injections of money before a power plant can even be built. And it's a centralised power source, it's not diffuse. So politically, nuclear power is very appealing because it just makes government bigger. But back to the two-party system, I really didn't want this episode to be about politics, but I have to frame the discussion about nuclear power with politics because it's all coming through politics. A two-party system really, I know there are some people that scoff at this and they think what I'm about to say is backwards and childish and irresponsible. But at this late stage of Western democracies, I think this is fair to say this. A two-party system has evolved to be a two-party system because there is no danger of the populace or free-thinking people to influence it. It's just all about maintaining the status quo. So I liken the two-party system, particularly the colours red and blue in Australia, to cola. So blue, Liberal Party, Pepsi. You might like Pepsi. Good on you. Red, the Australian Labor Party, Coca-Cola. You might prefer Coca-Cola because it's the real thing. It's not Pepsi. Fine, but can you appreciate how narrow your worldview is now because your preferences are for just different brands of cola? Like, strip away the colour and the branding, it's coloured, carbonated sugar water. Often nice to have in a tall glass filled with ice on a hot day, but you drink it every day and you'll get diabetes or worse. So this proposal, let's go through the proposal. Australia contemplating its own glow up. There's a reason to, before I circle back to politics. Australia's power stations are coal-fired. Australia is a country rich in natural resources, particularly coal, but a lot of those power stations are reaching the end of their life, and coal has fallen out of favour because of the arguments about climate change and the concern that the burning of fossil fuels is contributing to that. This video is not going to be about that. We have a lot of coal in the ground in Australia. It's just become politically difficult to promote the use of it. Some would argue that the proposal to build 7 nuclear power stations around the country is a bait and switch by the opposition because really they'll just want to keep the coal industry going because it's unlikely these nuclear power stations will get built, but people think they're doing something. That's another discussion. But the proposal from the blue team, Peter Dutton, the team not in power at the moment, if they get elected at the next Australian election, their proposal is to build, what is it? Yes, I've said 7 nuclear power plants by 2050. Well, that's a quarter of a century away. Should they be elected to power at the next election? Now, some groups have costed this and they've put forward an estimate which the blue team has refuted. They said it was like $30 billion overestimated. But anyway, it's a lot of money. So the estimate on the high side is that's $387 billion. $387 billion over the next 25 years to build these power plants. Now, as I said, the blue team argued against that estimate and said it was too high, but then their revised estimate still sounded pretty high to me. It was like 330 something billion dollars. Now that's a lot of money, but this is also an opportunity to highlight the hypocrisy of the good side, the red team, because while they have put forward a lot of their arguments are rational about why this is too much money, obviously, and Australia doesn't need it because we have heaps of sun for solar. They won't say we've got heaps of coal, or they won't say we've got heaps of gas because, it's politically difficult to talk about those resources that we're richest in. They make hay of the argument that this is an obscene amount of government spending. But as I said earlier, in a two-party political system, both sides love spending billions of dollars of the public's money. So on the one hand, the Labor government, they're criticising the opposition, the Liberal government, for proposing to spend over 380, let's say it's between 340 to 390 billion dollars over the next 25 years to build 7 nuclear power plants. What everyone has forgotten, and their friends in the media are hesitant to bring up, is the Labor government, while they're not proposing to build nuclear power plants, they have actually committed to spend, what is it? It's $368 billion, so almost the same amount as the money proposed for 7 nuclear power plants. They've proposed to spend $368 billion, are you ready for this? Not for energy generation, to purchase between 8 and 13 nuclear submarines from the US and the UK. So they pretend that they're ideologically cleaner than the blue team. The red team pretends that because, they're not being as irresponsible to propose $387 billion for 7 nuclear power plants, but they've already committed almost $370 billion over the next, maybe it's the same period of time, let's say over the next 25 years, to obtain between 8 and 13 nuclear submarines. So the kind of gentler wing of the two-party system has committed almost the same amount of money to purchase underwater death machines, nuclear-powered underwater death machines. I doubt they will arrive in time, but that is a subject for another podcast. It's between 8 and 13 because a number of them have to be designed and built, but as a stopgap measure, we would buy 2 second-hand submarines from the US, and then we would train the crew while the others are being built, and then there could be an option to buy a couple more. That's why it's a range between 8 and 13. So yeah, we're not as stupid or irresponsible to spend $387 billion on 7 nuclear power plants, but we're committing almost $370 billion for nuclear-powered underwater death machines, which is another example of a law will have to be repealed for Australia to take delivery of those because, we have laws against nuclear-powered vessels. So all that is window dressing or setting the table for the fact that the party opposed to the building of the 7 nuclear power plants, Labor, their hands aren't clean either because of what we're doing with the submarines. I mean, rationally, I would argue if you were going to spend that amount of money spend it on something that could actually improve the power grid and generate energy. But, it's a false choice, because if the blue team are in power, the submarines are still being ordered and paid for. So this is like, we're now approaching like $760 billion under the blue team because of their proposal for the 7 nuclear power plants. Anyway, so why even talk about nuclear power now? It almost seems like something from a previous age. After the atomic bomb was created, obviously it had a dual use: nuclear fission for a terrible use, weapons, but also for fission to generate energy as well. That's why it was very appealing, because you can actually obtain an enormous amount of energy from a small footprint. So the material that feeds a nuclear power station, it's very energy dense. So a nuclear power plant, its footprint compared to a wind farm with all those rotating windmill blades, or a giant solar farm, the footprint of the nuclear power station is much smaller. It's more contained, and it's generating more energy from a smaller footprint. It's a higher density of energy relevant to its footprint. So, I mean, the numbers are inarguable. A 20-gram pellet of uranium. Imagine measuring 20 grams of something in your the scales in your kitchen when you're preparing a recipe, like 20 grams of butter. It's nothing. A 20-gram pellet of uranium can provide the same amount of electricity as 400 kilograms of coal. So imagine what 400 kilograms of coal would look like. That's, almost half a ton. That would be a big pile of that dirty substance. And then next to it, a 20-gram pellet of uranium, releasing the same amount of energy. So, I mean, just that illustration shows why nuclear power is so appealing. While it's easier to feel better about wind and solar because they're termed as renewables, they come at a cost. So they require more land than fossil fuel production. And also over time, I did not realize this, but it makes sense. A wind farm has a finite life, so the infrastructure fragments over time, and it reaches a point where repairing or maintaining it is too costly. So there's that. I'll just check the camera. Yeah, so it reaches a point where maintaining the infrastructure over time becomes too costly, and wind farms eventually are abandoned, and you actually have abandoned, decaying wind farms that are just sitting there in the elements. So that's quite wasteful. Also, I think it's easy to argue that wind and solar farms are unsightly. I'm not saying a nuclear power plant looks beautiful, but because the footprint is so much larger for a wind or solar farm, it spoils the landscape. Also, this is awful, but the amount of wildlife, birds in particular, that meet an end at the wind farm is really disturbing. I mean, the constant rotation of those blades, well, it's not constant because it's dependent on wind, but when they're running at peak capacity, this can like disrupt bird life, and many of the birds fly into these blades. And so beneath these wind turbines, it's like a graveyard of migratory birds. Our bats too, because they collide with the wind turbines. Also, there's quite a bit of debate online. This is quite a polarizing debate. There are offshore wind farms that are mounted on the seafloor, and some people believe that the activity and the vibration of the offshore wind farms is disrupting the acoustic environment of the ocean, and dolphins, porpoises, and whales who, navigate with sonar or other ways, they're very sound sensitive. There is a belief that this disrupted acoustic environment from offshore wind farms results in whales beaching. There was a famous incident where there was a lot of beached whales in close proximity to an offshore wind farm, and the opponents of wind farms pointed at this occurrence and said, well, look how bad they are. They're killing the whales. That seems to be the ultimate benchmark if something's bad, not if people die, not if groups or countries we dislike suffer trauma or tragedy. No, the ultimate benchmark is, what about the whales? Are the whales okay? If the whales are not okay, then it's like, you bastards, what have you done? But there's some debate about this because the people who are pro wind farms have argued that the whales that washed up ashore in proximity to the offshore wind farm did so because they suffered ship strikes, which does happen. Ships collide with whales regularly, and who comes off better in that interaction? Well, it's always a ship, so the whale dies. But the thing is, it was very hard for me when I wrote these notes for this episode. It was very hard for me to obtain a clear-cut view of whether the offshore wind farms were harming whales, because the people who argued that they weren't are groups of people like Greenpeace. They were coming from a position that our planet, our society needs renewable energy, less reliance, or even complete phasing out of fossil fuel. So they already have a bias because they wouldn't want it to turn out. They wouldn't want this story to be that offshore wind farms are actually harming whales, because then that hurts their other arguments. But they could be right. It could be true. It may not have harmed the whales. But interestingly enough, going back to ideology and how even a discussion about energy is just an expression of someone's preferences or signaling, that they're the right type of person, a lot of the people professing their concern about the whales were actually groups that traditionally would not give a damn about whales. So people pro fossil fuels and the oil industry, and now for oil and gas to be discovered offshore requires mapping the sea floor, and to map the sea floor requires enormous bursts of sound, and the sound, when it bounces back to the ship or the vessel mapping it to, form a picture of what's happening not only on the sea floor but below it, that intense acoustic activity, that has been proven to disrupt cetaceans, whales, porpoises, dolphins, goodness knows what else. And so just a regular part of oil and gas exploration is actually detrimental, if not fatal, to whales. So the people shaking their fist at wind farms, it's interesting because suddenly they have discovered their love of whales, not because they think whales are lovable. I myself think whales are very lovable. But it's just interesting that people that normally would not give a damn about whales suddenly give a damn about them because they can see that as a point of division with renewables and the wind farm. So very hard for me to get a clear picture on what is going on there. But yes, acoustic exploration for oil and gas does harm whales and dolphins. Does the vibration from offshore wind farms do the same? Maybe. Back to nuclear power. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. So despite the bad publicity of nuclear energy and the massive amounts of government spending requiring for it to get off the ground, get working, why are people even talking about it? Well, there's a reason, and the energy from renewables is not what you refer to as constant base load, which makes sense because the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine all the time. That's why people talk about batteries to supplement the solar farms and the wind farms, but it's not a constant base load, whereas nuclear power is a constant base load. And so there is a term that people in the energy industry use, and it's called firming up. So for us to rely solely on wind and solar, we won't have a constant base load. We would need the power grid to be firmed up. There is more demand on the power grid. More people moving into some countries, people adopting electric vehicles, they need to be charged. But interestingly, I think the biggest thing that is sucking juice is now that generative AI has arrived. The data centers, which are essentially other people's computers, all these racks of computers in massive warehouses, they are all in the process of being upgraded to run the large language models and the calculations that make ChatGPT work. Now that's a simplification because generative AI will be used for other things, like, creating humorous pictures of kittens driving Formula One cars. I'm sure there's other practical applications, but nevertheless, all the tech companies have put everything on generative AI because they need their next source of growth. They're trying to convince everyone to buy new computers that use generative AI. They're trying to convince people to adopt new software tools that use generative AI. All this stuff does not run on your phone or your laptop. It runs in massive data centers that have all had to be upgraded to run these things called GPUs, which NVIDIA make, and they are so power hungry. So all the, interestingly, the tech companies promoted themselves as being mindful of sustainability and energy efficiency, but they've realized that all their claims now have to be reassessed because they're pushing so hard with generative AI, and the grid, not just Australia, many other countries, is not set up to service the power demand from all these AI data centers. Just checking if I'm melting down again. No, we're all good. So the companies who aren't, interestingly, private companies, when I say private companies, I'm talking about Microsoft, I'm talking about Amazon, I'm talking about Meta. Have I missed one? I'm sure I've missed one. Meta, Amazon, Microsoft. Yeah, there's probably another one. They know that their future growth depends on a constant baseload of power which doesn't exist. So the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in the US, which was due to be completely decommissioned, after the accident in the 70s. It went from 2 reactors down to 1 reactor. But even that 1 reactor was due to be shut down. Microsoft have stepped in, approached the energy company that manages 3 Mile Island and says, we will buy X amount of power from you if you keep the nuclear power station running. So the power company's sweet. We don't have to spend all that time and money to decommission it. We can get it running again, even employ people. I know who the other person was, Bill Gates. Bill Gates has bought land somewhere to build a new nuclear power plant. I'll get to that in a moment. Yes, so there's Microsoft, Amazon have purchased a data center that's right next to a nuclear power station. Not sure what Meta is doing, but they are doing something with nuclear power. And Bill Gates is now getting into nuclear power as well. So the tech companies are the ones signaling to everyone that it's now okay to get back into nuclear, because we are dependent on everything they make. And if we want to continue using their trinkets to the expense of our happiness and personal relationships, subject for another podcast, we need to get with the program too. But, this isn't now an ideological discussion. These tech companies are putting money into it because without nuclear power, they will not survive. They cannot run their empires. I'm sorry, they can't. If anyone tells you this, it's bullshit. They cannot run their empires on wind and solar. If they could, the whole planet would be covered in windmills and solar panels, but they know they can't.